Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and this is actually not an entirely new video. This is a new introduction to a video that I did about a year ago in September of 2016. And I am reposting it now with this new introduction because the new version, the new expanded edition of the collector grade book Sturmgewehr has just recently published. And in it, there is some interesting additional information about the rifle that we're looking at in this video. So I wanted to replace the intro with one that properly explains the history of this gun, which I didn't quite get right in the original version. Now, as you may be aware, Hitler himself was not initially a fan of the Sturmgewehr concept, the intermediate cartridge, the 8x33mm cartridge. And in fact, on like 3 separate occasions, he specifically said, no, don't make that gun. And yet, despite this, there were elements of the German ordnance system that recognized the value of the assault rifle concept and continued to push for its development, even despite being specifically told not to by Hitler. Now, one of these in particular, there was an armament conference at the very end of June 1942. And at this point, Hitler kind of mollified his position. He went from saying, no, there will be no machine carbine, MKb, Maschinen Karabiner development. Instead, he said, you can go ahead and develop it as long as it uses the standard 8x57 Mauser cartridge, the full power cartridge. And this gave the Ordnance Department an opening to keep working on the gun they really wanted, as long as they also started developing the same idea in 8 Mauser. Now, everybody knew, or anyone who knew anything, realized that the assault rifle concept in a full power rifle cartridge simply wasn't going to work. The whole point of the concept was you could get accurate single shot fire at medium range and then controllable full auto fire at close range. And in 8mm Mauser, controllable full auto fire was not going to happen. But they could accomplish a couple of political goals by developing such a rifle anyway, and that's exactly what they did. So they contracted with the Gustloff company to develop basically a machine carbine in 8mm Mauser, and that's what we have here. It was designated the MKb-42G for Gustloff. Now, Gustloff developed 2 versions of it in-house, and they had different names for the 2. They had the Model 206, which is what we have here, and that was semi-auto only, and they had the Model 208, which was selective fire, and same mechanism, but different trigger group, and we don't have one of those here to look at. And this rifle would prove to be kind of a red herring that would allow continued development of the rifle that everybody really wanted, which was what would become the Sturmgewehr. It was the Haenel MKb-42H. And it did a couple other things as well. Because it was contracted out to Gustloff, Gustloff was a very politically connected company with the Nazi Party, and by giving Gustloff a juicy development project like this, it kind of kept some of the political pressure off of this development process. And then ultimately what a lot of people figured is that when it actually came time to do firing trials, it would be really obvious how ineffective 8mm Mauser was fired full auto from the shoulder, and this would give more incentive to adopt the 8x33 short cartridge. Now, as far as I can tell, actual field trials never occurred with this rifle because they never manufactured enough of them to get to that point. There was a letter in the files, in German ordnance files from January of 1943, mentioning that actual production of these guns by Gustloff was at least 12 to 18 months away. And that would put it somewhere in the first half of 1944. Well, that was way too far down the road to satisfy anybody. There was a dramatic need for self-loading firearms right now, as of the beginning of 43. Gewehr 41 production was still slow. Gewehr 43 production hadn't begun yet. And so really the only alternative left was to continue development of the MKb-42H, which conveniently is what everyone in the know actually was trying to do. So at that point, or thereabouts, the development of this Gustloff rifle was shut down. It wouldn't be ready in time to do any good anyway, so why bother continuing it? And the story would continue from there back to the 8mm Kurz cartridge. So, with that history in mind, now let's go ahead and take a look at the mechanics of how this interesting prototype actually works. So let's start by taking a look at the markings here, which is quite easy because there's only one. It is this on top of the receiver. is 206/13. Of course, 206 is the model number. 13 is the serial number of this particular example. We'll see 13s on many of the parts inside. Now I also want to take a quick look at the magazine. This is actually a cut-down MG13 magazine. In fact, if we look at the markings closely, see right there, this is actually a fairly early one. This is from that G code. We can actually show that this is a 1935 manufacture magazine. So they got kind of an older magazine to cut down and use. If you look at the bottom of the magazine here, you can see that on the original mag, these ribs ran quite a lot farther down. They just cut the mag off flat and stuck a floor plate on it. So presumably this is a 10-round magazine. We have a safety on the side of the rifle. It's a 180-degree throw, and this is actually the fire position. That is the safe position. The trigger is totally locked up in the safe position. It's interesting that in this one, normally you like point the selector at the icon that you want. In this case, you actually cover up the one that you don't want so that the exposed marking is the one that's applicable. We have our bolt handle here on the side, and this does lock open when the magazine's empty, like so. It is a reciprocating bolt handle. We'll see when we get inside that it's fixed to the operating rod and the gas piston. So that allows you to lock the rifle open. To remove the magazine, we have this rear tab which pushes forward. There we go. It's a little tight when the bolt's locked open. That's our magazine, 10-round converted MG13 magazine. Then this is actually the bolt hold open. So if I hold the bolt back, pull that down, I can drop the bolt. If I want to lock the bolt open without a magazine or with a loaded magazine, open it, push this tab up, and it will hold the bolt in place. Again, when we take this apart, you'll see exactly how that works. Now, there's a little bit of a wood handguard here on the bottom. There's a little more of it on this side because on this side we have a cutout for this is the sleeve that the charging handle rides in. So our rear sight, pretty typical, runs out to 1,200 meters, which is what you'd expect for a semi-auto infantry rifle of this time period. The front sight is a very standard German triangular post, a barleycorn front sight with a nice sheet metal hood there. So I'm going to start with disassembly of the stock because I took this off just out of curiosity and wow, it's really weird inside. So we'll start with that. This actually has 2 screws that go clean through it, and these are outside screws, these are inner screws, and they mate together to hold in place. All right, we've got the 2 screws out, and when we take this apart, what do we find but this weirdness? This is really strange. I've never seen anything quite like this before. So there is actually a sheet metal shell of a stock here. This center part is your sling swivel, or your sling slot. The butt plate is fixed to the back of this shell, and this the wood on this side, well, it would probably come off. So this wood is being held on by this screw, and it's in there tight, and you know what, I'm not going to mess with it because the other side is going to look just like this one. I'm sure these grooves are in there to strengthen it, to prevent it from denting, although in theory the wood would help with that. This is just a thin shell of wood that slots into the butt plate like that and closes. And then that attaches to the back end of the rifle. You can see here that this was a stamped sheet that was kind of hammered and then welded into place to match up with the back of the receiver. This was originally 2 pieces, this sheet, and you can see the welding seam there and the seam there, top and bottom, where they were pressed together. The Germans did like their stamped components, and this is a good example of it. You can actually see the welding seam right along the top of that as well, and little bits and pieces of it here on the bottom. Now, people are going to ask about this hole. I believe that hole is supposed to be for a disassembly button, which has been bent slightly out of shape. You'll see that in just a minute. The next step I'm going to take is actually to remove this wooden handguard, which this is just like a heat shield shell. All right, those two screws are nice and loose. And again, this is really quite a lot like the stock, actually. It's just a very thin piece of wood as a shell over this sheet metal handguard action cover thing. This actually, I would call this the op rod cover. Now, to disassemble the mechanical bits, we have these two levers. They are cross pins that connect the outer receiver to the trigger group. So I'm going to rotate each of them down 90 degrees. They are keyed. I can wiggle this one out like that. You can see the key on it right there. It's the front pin. And the back pin's a little easier. There's the back pin. And with those out, actually first I have to slide the handguard forward. It's in a pair of little rails there. So this slides out. It has these two locating holes which align with that front disassembly pin. So now this is out. Now we can take out the trigger group, and it just lifts right out. There we go. Now I suspect, this is the part I'd mentioned, I suspect this tab is supposed to bend backwards a little bit more and actually fill that hole in the receiver. So I think what you're supposed to do is take out the two pins, and then you're supposed to have to push in here, probably with a cartridge, to bend this tab forward and allow this to come out. But clearly this isn't doing that at the moment. I think the heat treat on that wasn't right, or they didn't bother with it, and so it really does nothing at this point. Now we'll look at the trigger group in a minute, because that's complicated and weird and interesting. But first, let's look at the action. We have a little more we can disassemble, actually. We have our mainspring here. There we go. Got that nice long mainspring out, and it's got a guide rod in it. We'll leave the guide rod in just in case it matters which end that goes in. Now, we're almost done with disassembly. Now what I can do is actually pull the bolt out the back. There's our bolt assembly. Now the last bit of disassembly would be to pull the gas tube, and then we could pull the operating rod out. However, I'm not going to be able to do that. This is held in place by a little cam here, a little plunger. I can lift this plunger up, I can rotate it so that it's out of the way, and then the gas tube here is dovetailed on, and I should be able to push it back, at which point it would slide in this dovetail, and it would move back and then come out. However, it's very stiff, and I don't want to hammer on it with a punch. I suspect, since we have the gas port right in here, I suspect that has gotten a bit full of carbon and is seized up a bit. I'm sure with some soaking and a little judicious use of a brass punch, you could get it disassembled, but I'm not going to be the one to do that. And I may be misunderstanding exactly how this latch works. However, while we're here, I do want to point out serial number 13 on both of these parts. We'll see that regularly through the gun. We have an upper barrel cover here, which is not going to come off because it's riveted in place. And then we have this operating rod. So up here, it's clearly a gas piston. You can see gas rings on the piston here when we open it up. And then we have these two arms, which run all the way back in the receiver, and they drag the bolt back and forth. And those arms are connected to the bolt handle here. So the really relevant mechanical bit for locking is this block right here, which lifts up and down. It's traveling in this track. And what happens is, so you're looking into the bottom of the gun right now. When the bolt handle comes all the way forward, this block is pulled downward, which is towards you on the screen. When it does that, it has a pair of locking lugs right in here that engage with the bolt. Then when the handle, the gas piston, starts to go back, you can see that the first thing it does is push this block upward or away from the camera. That's going to push these locking lugs right here upward, out of engagement with the bolt, and then the bolt can be pulled backwards. If we look at the bolt itself, we've got these two recesses right here, which correspond to these two lugs in that block. So when this block comes up, these lugs match with those, bolt is fixed in place and can't move, can fire, and then it's the gas piston that causes this to unlock like that and then cycle. Now let's take a quick look at our the bolt assembly itself. This is a sheet metal cover, which there are going to be a few things underneath it, but I think they're mostly manufacturing features, and for example the pin holding this in. This in theory slides off the back, but again it's very tight. It moves just a little bit and I'm not going to force it, so that's going to stay in place for this video. Now we have a couple features on here that are worth taking a look at. First off, we can see the firing pin through there. We can see at the front that it's got a spring, so it is a spring-loaded firing pin. We've got these two little tails or feet on the bolt. What these do is actually control the back end of the bolt. So the front's being controlled by the locking block. They wanted to make sure that the back end couldn't wiggle around, and so these mate up with a pair of welded pieces inside the receiver. We'll touch on that in a minute. And then this guy is part of the trigger mechanism. So this forces the disconnector to be pushed downward while cycling. And we'll see why when we look at the trigger group. That's important to make sure that the rifle doesn't fire multiple rounds with one trigger pull. We have another serial number 13 there. I believe we have them on both of those little tails. Interestingly, we also have a little Nazi eagle there on the front of the bolt. I didn't really expect to see that. Extractors on the top. Of course, this ejects vertically out the top of the rifle. Now I mentioned these two little tails. Those are going to move into this surface and one that's here on the opposite side of the receiver. So the op rod here, when it goes fully forward, that foot right there pushes this upward, which locks the bolt in place. In fact, we can see that if I put the bolt in. All right, so you can see the relevant moving pieces here. We've got our little tail right there sitting in this hook, this empty space in the operating rod. This is going to go all the way forward. The bolt goes into this locking block, and then with the last bit of travel, the locking block rises, or drops actually, goes towards the camera. That locks the bolt, and now you can see that this tail has pushed this little foot into its space. So it comes up there, it's forward, pushed down. Now it's locked in place, which prevents the back end of the bolt from moving at all while you're firing. And you can see also that there's a cam on the top of the receiver that pushes this upwards, or forwards, I suppose, when the bolt's fully in battery. Keep that in mind. You'll see it in a minute. Now, something else I want to point out here. You can see that this is a sheet metal receiver, obviously, but there's a piece here and a piece here, for example, that are welded into place. We have another piece like that right here, a solid milled piece. That one is crimped into the receiver right here. So what you're looking at is a sheet metal outer receiver, but then it has to have reinforced pieces inside for things to actually work against. So we've got the rivets here and here, which are the main connection to these two blocks. Those two blocks are necessary to give the bolt something something precise to travel on. If you just had a sheet metal receiver, it's hard to have really precisely finished surfaces in it because you're making this with a big stamping die. Much better to stamp this out and have it reasonably precise, and then have all of your finish operations done to actual milled surfaces inside. That gives you more material to work with and a more precise surface. All right, now the trigger group. This thing is weird. So let's actually start with the bolt hold open. Now you can see how that works. It just pushes this piece up, which blocks the front of the bolt. Actually quite simple. So the way this thing works is, this is the hammer, of course, and then this long piece here, this one, is the sear. And when I pull the trigger, that sear, let's go this way. When I pull the trigger, the sear, this back end goes up, which means the front end, right down in there, goes down. This surface right here is what's actually hooking under this surface. So that's what's holding the hammer back when it's cocked. So in order for it to fire, the front end has to go down, which means the rear end has to go up. So when I'm pulling the trigger, I'm rotating this part right here. That part pushes up on this little part. This little part actually impinges on the main sear and pushes it up. Now what happens is when I pull this all the way, this little guy that's actually pushing on the sear is going to travel all the way back and snap past. See how it comes out on the inside? Right there. Once it's done that, it can no longer push on the, it no longer pushes on this sear. So I have to release the trigger to reset it before I can fire again. At this point, the hammer would come back when it cycles, cock, and stay there. I have to release the trigger. Now, what if I don't quite pull the trigger far enough for that to happen? Say right there, the hammer has released, but the sear's just in the right place that it will fire full auto. Well, the answer to that is this disconnector, which, when this pushes down, it forces the back tail of this little piece up. Remember the hook on the front of the bolt? This guy? That guy's job is to push this down to guarantee that the action disconnects and it only fires one round. So, let's see. So, there's my trigger held just right to fire full auto until I push this down. Now, it resets. That complicated enough? This is a really goofy and very stereotypically German system. The system used in the M1 Garand does this, frankly, I think a lot better, more simply and in a smaller space. So there you go, guys. This is a really interesting and unusual operating system that we've got going here. The closest comparisons I can come up with would actually be, historically, the Bergmann-Bayard model of 1908, 1903, 1910 worked kind of like this. The Nambu Type 94 actually worked kind of like this. And more recently, the Arsenal Strike 1 pistols actually work quite similarly to this. It's pretty cool. They say that it's a brand new idea, but you know what? There's pretty much nothing's a brand new idea. There's always someone who's done it first, like Gustloff in this case. No. What's really cool about this one is, of course, it is not locked away in a museum. It is coming up for sale. So if you'd like to own this thing yourself, take a look at the description text below. You'll find a link there to Rock Island's catalog page on it. You can look at their photos, look at their description. And while I doubt anyone would want to just drop a bid online for this, you could do that. Or you can come down here to the auction house in September, check out the rifle yourself, and then participate live in the auction. Thanks for watching.